Hi, you're on the This Is Crime channel. I'm Matilda. Listen to my new story.
Lock your doors at night. It was a quiet summer night in a small town in North Wales. It was still a few hours before dawn, and its inhabitants were sound asleep in their beds. None of them suspected that a criminal had broken into one of the houses where a family of 4, including 2 children, lived, committing one of the worst crimes in the history of these places. Fire. In the early morning of June 27, 1999, a man living in a private house on the outskirts of the town of Clydach, population about 7,500, went out into the yard and smelled smoke. When he looked around, he saw a column of smoke and flames coming out of the windows of the house of his neighbor, 80-year-old Doris Dawson. He knew that the elderly woman was seriously ill and would not be able to get out of the house on her own. The man wanted to rush to help the old woman, but was stopped by his wife, who had already called the emergency services, which arrived on the scene in 10 minutes. Having started to extinguish the fire, the firefighters immediately noticed one oddity. The fire had 2 fires. This indicated that the fire appeared in the house was not accidental at all. Having done their job and going inside, they were convinced of that. The family. At that time in the house lived 4. The owner, Doris Dawson, her daughter, 34-year-old Amanda, Mandy Power, and 2 granddaughters pensioner, 10-year-old Katie and 8-year-old Emily. Alas, none of them showed signs of life. Even with a cursory examination of the scene, it was clear that the cause of their deaths was not carbon monoxide. Apparently, the perpetrator, wielding some heavy object, set the fire for one purpose: to hide the traces of his atrocities. The attacker's primary target was apparently Mandy Power. The woman had 38 injuries, more than all the others combined, and was the only one forced into intimacy. Interestingly, the perpetrator used a special device for the latter. Mandy's eldest daughter, Katie, was found in the doorway of the nursery. It appears she tried to run away, but didn't make it. Emily, on the other hand, wanted to hide, under a blanket. Alas, that didn't save her. Their grandmother, Doris, who was critically ill and walking impaired, died in bed. According to the conclusions of forensic experts, the perpetrator acted very methodically and in cold blood, except in the case of Mandy. He obviously planned everything in advance and prepared for it for a long time. Footprints. Thanks to the analysis of traces found at the scene of the crime, the police were able to establish an approximate sequence of events. Let's start with how the villain got in. There were no signs of forced entry on the door, so it was unlocked, or he had a key. Unlikely, as only family members had keys. Since Doris's death occurred around 9 p.m., it is obvious that the perpetrator entered the house as early as June 26th. Most likely, the old lady heard nothing, as she did not even try to get out of bed. After taking her life, the villain lurked in the dwelling and waited. Mandy and her daughters returned home around 11 p.m. After waiting for the right moment, the perpetrator, holding a heavy metal bar firmly in his hands, left his hiding place. Having accomplished what he had planned, the villain took Mandy into the bathroom and washed her. Why? Probably to cover his tracks. He then thoroughly searched the house, but since all valuables were left in their places, the police assumed that this was the criminal's way of confusing the law enforcers by staging a robbery. Resonance. The crime shocked the residents of Clydach. Expectedly, they demanded that all forces be immediately thrown into the search for the villain who had committed such a terrible atrocity on a young mother, her children, and an elderly woman. The local police were under tremendous pressure as the news of the murder went national. The crime in the small Welsh town was covered by all the leading British media. Therefore, when on June 28th at a special press conference, a police spokesman said that the authorities had a lot of evidence, with the help of which they will accurately establish the identity of the criminal. Everyone anticipated the imminent arrest of the villain. The law enforcers did indeed have several clues left by the criminal. Among them were a massive gold chain and a white sock, which the attacker used as a glove. In addition, experts managed to find traces of someone else's DNA on Mandy's clothes. But after analyzing it, turned out that the samples belonged not to one person, but to 2. A single mom. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that the crime was personal. That's why detectives focused on Mandy Power's immediate family and friends. The woman not so long ago divorced, but remained on good terms with her ex-husband, Michael Power. The couple saw each other often, as the man took his daughters for the weekend or came just for no reason. Michael was very fond of the girls and never showed any aggression towards his ex-wife or children. In addition, his DNA did not match any of the samples from the crime scene. On that basis, the man was ruled out as a suspect. Girlfriend. After separating from her husband, Mandy decided to get in shape and started going to the gym. Soon she met Allison Lewis, a retired police officer. The reason for Allison's departure from the service was an accident at work, which resulted in the death of her partner. This tragedy had a serious impact on the woman's mental health, causing her to take antidepressants even after her dismissal. Mandy and Allison quickly found a common language, and if in the beginning they were connected only friendship, then later it grew into something more. Lewis was married, so the women kept their relationship in the strictest secrecy. Allison's husband, Stephen Lewis, worked in the police. What is interesting, the man served in the same unit with his wife's twin brother Stuart. By a strange coincidence, it was he who arrived at the scene of the crime first. When law enforcement became aware of the affair between Power and Lewis, Allison, of course, became the prime suspect in the murder. And when they found that Lewis's DNA matched one of the samples found on Mandy's clothes, the investigators' confidence increased many times over. On the other hand, after learning of her friend's death, Allison experienced a great shock. The woman fell into a hysterical state from which she could not get out of the doctors. As a result, the former police officer had to be hospitalized in a psychiatric clinic. Husband. Allison was able to calm down and testify only after 3 days. The woman honestly told about the secret relationship with Mandy, adding that the last time she saw her friend in her home in the evening of June 26th, that is, a few hours before her death. She left the children at a friend's house and came to my house around 8 p.m. At about 9 p.m., my husband went to bed, and Mandy and I got some privacy in the guest room. At 9:40 p.m., she left for home, after which I went to Stephen's bedroom. Neither my husband nor I left the house. We slept all night together, Allison revealed. It is now clear how traces of Allison's DNA could have appeared on Mandy's clothes. Based on this information and the woman's intense distress over her friend's death, police turned their attention to her husband, Stephen. Having learned of the affair, the man may well have wanted revenge on Mandy for stealing his wife from him. However, Stephen insisted that he knew nothing about Allison's affair on the side. In addition, his DNA did not match the sample from the crime scene, and it is unlikely that the man could leave the house unnoticed from his wife. Suspects. Despite the lack of any hard evidence, the whole trio, Allison, Stephen, and Stuart, were taken into custody on suspicion of murdering the Power family. The defendants flatly refused to plead guilty. But the residents of Clydach, fueled by articles in the Yellow Press, no longer had any doubts about their guilt. The journalists focused mainly on Allison. They savored every detail of the woman's biography, from her black belt in karate and her passion for rugby, to her preferences in the choice of partners and the suspicious death of a colleague. Based on what the newspapermen had written, Allison was the perfect candidate for the role of the killer. So when 2 weeks later, all three of them, Allison, Stephen, and Stuart, were released due to lack of evidence, the public was, to put it mildly, bewildered. David. The police spent a long time examining the trio for their involvement in the crime, but eventually, detectives concluded that they had nothing to do with the case and cleared them of all suspicion. Next, law enforcers set out to find out who the second DNA found on Mandy's clothing belonged to. They were lucky only 18 months after the tragedy, when the DNA of a 38-year-old resident of the neighboring town of Craig CEFN Park, named David Morris, was uploaded to the database. He was arrested, incidentally, for a pub brawl. David worked as a construction worker and was married to longtime girlfriend Mandy, but apparently Morris and Power had more than that in common. According to their cell phone carrier, they occasionally called and texted each other. Although the man denied they were in a secret relationship, everything pointed the other way. The evidence against Morris. Apart from the suspicion that Mandy and David were having an affair, David had no alibi for the time of the murder. The man claimed that on the evening of June 26th, he was relaxing with his wife in a local pub. But at around 10 p.m., an argument broke out between them, causing the woman to leave the establishment. Morris did not stop her as he noticed Mandy among the customers. It transpired that the woman had stopped at the pub briefly before going to pick up her children. David did not deny that he tried to hit on Mandy, but was refused and switched to another woman. This, incidentally, was confirmed by a witness, according to whom the couple briefly cuddled in the corner, and then the woman left the establishment alone. Morris left the pub around 11:30 p.m., but according to his wife, he did not arrive home until 4:30 a.m. The man told police that he initially had the idea of visiting his parents, but changed his mind halfway through and returned home. The law enforcement officers did not believe David. According to their version, the man, being under the influence of alcohol, decided to go not to his parents, but to Mandy. They were finally convinced of this after they learned from his relative that in the summer of 1999, Morris lost a gold chain. The chain. When questioned, David denied his guilt, and when it came to the chain, he stated that he had never lost it. However, these words contradicted the testimony of the suspect's cousin, Eric Williams. Around July, I noticed that David had a new chain similar to the one he had before. I asked him about the old chain. He suddenly got nervous and rudely replied that it was still the same old chain. It seemed strange because I was sure of the opposite. It was different, said Eric Williams. Detectives decided to nail David harder. This brought some results. The man admitted that several times met with Mandy, but would never go for murder because he himself had 3 small children. I couldn't hurt a child. Never. It's sacred to me, he repeated later in court. Court. On that last statement, David seemed to be honest. His wife confirmed that Morris had never raised a hand against her or the children. True, when it came to fair fights, he was not averse to swinging his fists. His DNA ended up in a national database after one of those fights. Curiously enough, no one ever reported him to the police until the last incident. And according to the results of the court, which considered the fight in December 2000, his actions were recognized as self-defense. However, this did not stop the police from arresting Morris and charging him with the murder of the Power family. During the trial, which began in 2001, the prosecution relied on a single piece of evidence, a gold chain found at the scene. David's DNA was not found on the jewelry, but it did contain traces of paint identical to the paint he used at work to paint an object. The fact that the man was in the pub with his wife at 9 p.m. when Doris Dawson is alleged to have died was, alas, ignored. In June 2002, a jury unanimously found David Morris guilty, and he was sentenced to 4 life terms. The man appealed, but lost. Guilty or not guilty? It may seem like a monstrous miscarriage of justice to convict a man on the basis of a single piece of evidence, and even circumstantial. However, in this case, the jury seems to have reached the right decision. David's wife and children fought hard to have Morris's case reviewed. In early 2021, the prosecutor's office finally heard them and decided to reinvestigate the case. It concluded in October 2021. Putting the evidence under more scrutiny, experts found minute traces of Morris's DNA on a sock left by the perpetrator at the crime scene. David had no way of answering the question of where his DNA came from on the sock, as he had died within the prison walls a few months earlier. His relatives, unwilling to accept defeat, did it for him. The prosecutor's office thinks it has put an end to the case. They haven't. David never wore white socks. We were married for over 10 years, in which I never once saw him wear light-colored socks. Even if they are his socks, he may have forgotten them in that house. But I believe he was framed. I will not name the names of the 3, said the deceased's wife. Mandy's ex-husband and her friend Allison, on the other hand, did not doubt David's guilt for a moment. Everything in the case is crystal clear. The jury and the judge couldn't have been more wrong. It still amazes me that so many people don't want to see Morris for who he really is. He's a calculating, cold-blooded maniac. I'm glad he's gone, Allison Lewis said after David's death. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and put a thumbs up. Look forward to more stories from the team of our channel. This is Criminal.